And I'm just here. My name is Pam Baldwin. I'm the superintendent of Asheville City Schools. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited about this turnout. And I'm here to welcome you to this beautiful high school campus. So thank you so much for coming out. But before I finish my welcome, I would love to see the hands of the students in the audience, either high school, middle school, or college level. Wonderful. Most of you have, if you've ever heard me talk ever, you know I'm all about children, and I believe this kind of event is so important for our students to see the community come together and have a conversation about things that need to happen. I believe that teaching by doing and learning by doing is the best way, and this is a great example of some wonderful professionals on our stage and a wonderful community that comes out to support all that we do. And I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience that support Asheville City Schools as well. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome to a beautiful event. I am next going to introduce Mr. Jim Stokely, representing Wilma Dykeman Legacy, and you're in for a great treat in a debate.
It's wonderful to see you out tonight. Can everyone hear me? Good. Well, thank you, Superintendent Baldwin. Isn't she a great addition to our city and region? I'm proud this evening to represent the Wilma Dykeman Legacy, a local nonprofit organization that was formed in 2012 to sustain the core values of an extraordinary Buncombe County native named Wilma Dykeman. One of Wilma's core values was the power of the spoken word. And what better way to illustrate that power than by debating the issues of the day through a structured discussion between matched sides. That's what a debate is. Now, some people have said to me, Jim, this is a sensitive topic to be debated. Well, in 1963, do the math, more than 50 years ago, when I was a student at Newport Grammar School, just across the Tennessee state line outside of Hot Springs, Wilma Dykeman came into our school and formed a debate club. And one of the topics we debated was resolved, Newport Grammar School should be integrated. Now, if we can debate that topic then, more than 50 years ago, as 13-year-olds, surely we can debate this topic here as adults. So the last thing I want to say is it takes a lot of work and it takes some money to produce an event like this. Funds generated by the local Friends of Wilma Dykeman, which keeps the legacy going, go directly to honoraria for the debaters as well as local advertising. So I would ask you to do one thing. Please take a brochure from the right-hand table just outside the auditorium on your way out. Consider becoming a friend of Wilma Dykeman. We have more debates planned, and your donations are critical to their success. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the head coach of the Asheville High School SILSA Speech and Debate Program, Mr. Keith Pittman.
We want to thank you for turning out tonight. This turnout exceeded even our expectations. When I was driving in, there were still cars behind me waiting to get in, so we're really thrilled, and this debate is going to be a wonderful dialogue for our community. I want to give you a little bit of a history of the Asheville High School SILSA Speech and Debate Program. I started that 21 years ago with a couple of students. I just thought it would be a good idea to go to a debate tournament. I was a high school and college debater myself, and I had an interest in forming a team. 2 students going around to tournaments in my car 21 years ago. I am proud to say that now, in our 21st year, our team this year has 105 members. That's roughly one out of every 13 students at Asheville High School, which I think is a pretty incredible number. And it just kind of speaks to what the students are doing year after year. The program kind of feeds off of itself. Students tell their friends and their friends and their friends, and it just grows and grows. We are a nationally ranked team. In fact, this year we are #1 in the Harvard National Congress rankings. And that took us a long time to get there, but we're proud of that. We also really believe in giving back to the community. There's not a lot, you watch the debates on television, regardless of which party it is, and you get a lot of, I don't know what it is, really. It's not debate. We want to model the real exchange of real ideas and good dialogue, discourse that is civil, but yet makes the point and allows ideas to freely be expressed, because that's what America is all about. And on the big stage, you don't see enough of that. So we want to model that, and we believe that this debate tonight is really going to help our community considerably come to an understanding of some things. And here's some points that really need to be made on both sides of the issue. So I encourage you to listen to the debate very carefully tonight. And I thank you for turning out. And again, thank you for your support of the Asheville High SILSA speech and debate team. We believe in giving back to the community, and we think this is one way that we can do this. And we are very happy to be partnering with the Wilma Dykeman It's been a long day. The Wilma Dykeman Legacy. Say that about 10 times fast. All right, thank you. And I just about forgot to introduce the person who really did everything. This was not a project that I was directly involved with. We have a great student leadership team, and one of our student leaders kind of took this on herself. But before I introduce her, I also want to thank one of my 7 assistant coaches who was very involved from the coach standpoint. Mr. Will Smith helped organize this team. And I just really don't know what I would do as a coach without Mr. Smith's help. But the student who really pulled this together, hours and hours and hours of work you're going to meet right now. The success from the debate team, the speech and debate team's end of this, is really due to the work of Chloe Dennison.
So my name is Chloe Dennison, and I'm a member of the student leadership on the Asheville High School speech and debate team. As Mr. Bittman already explained, debate is an absolutely invaluable activity for many students at the high school. This debate is somewhat unique in that the sides were pre-chosen. However, at the high school, we force debaters to prepare arguments for both sides of the topic. This enables them to gain understandings of other perspectives they likely would not have otherwise. Although some topics are controversial, we always strive to have a civil debate. It can foster meaningful and enlightening discussion on these controversial issues and will educate everyone involved. This is our goal for the Legacy Debate Series. Our student judges have been instructed to vote based on the content of the debate and not their personal issues. I think we can all agree that everyone in our society deserves an equal voice. So please join me in welcoming our moderator for today's debate, Mr. John Boyle of the Citizen Times.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Asheville High and the Debate Club, and all you good folks for turning out here on a Friday night. I think this is really impressive. I want to thank the Wilma Dykeman Legacy as well, and my newspaper, the Citizen Times. That is why I'm here. I'm the answer man. I am kind of stunned to be in the company of all these PhDs. As I tell very learned men, I make my living as a smart aleck, so I'm very impressed with people who actually have some knowledge. We are here to share some opinions and maybe provoke some thought, but we're not here to grandstand or take digs at one another. We want this to be a civil debate, with the exception you can say anything you want to Carl Monbauer. Okay? Carl and I go way back, and we actually like each other despite what everybody thinks. Carl's a true gentleman. All right, I want to go over a little bit of how this debate works, because the guys on the debate team know, but the rest of us probably don't. So there'll be first of all, a 4-minute constructive speech That's pre-written, both sides. Pro will go first, and there'll be a con speech. There will be a rebuttal to that. That's about 4 minutes. Both sides will go over their opponent's arguments. There'll be a summary, which is a 3-minute summary speech. Both sides will touch on the major arguments. They can use new evidence, but no new arguments can be made. And then there's a final focus, which is 2 minutes long on each side. We are also going to do, at the end of this, while the student judges will tally the scores, they are doing this in a very professional debate kind of way. While they're doing that, we're going to take a few questions from the audience for these gentlemen. And when we'll get to that, we ask you to direct the questions to the team, not to an individual. Tonight, as you know, the topic is resolved. Asheville has disenfranchised its African American population. It's nice to see they picked a nice tame topic for debate number one. This debate features, to my left and your right, Dr. Dwight Mullen, who is a political science professor at UNC Asheville. To his left, Dr. Darren Waters, who is a history professor at UNC Asheville. They will be arguing in support of the resolution. To my right and your left is Dr. Carl Mumpower, a psychologist here in town and an Asheville City Councilman for 8 years. And to his right, on the far end, is Isaac Herring, who is chair of Western Carolina University College Republicans. And we really appreciate Isaac stepping in. We had illness among one of the debaters, and he stepped up, so we really do appreciate that. I think, without further ado, we are ready to go. I want to say this is all of our first formal debating experience, probably, so we will probably mess this up at some point. Sawyer over here said she's going to keep me straight. If we do mess up, just please bear with us, but we will get underway here in just a second. Can you hear me? Okay. The first side will be pro for the 4-minute speech. Oh, just so you know, this is timed. There is a timer here in the audience going to be holding up cards, green, yellow, red system. These gentlemen have agreed not to go over, so I think we'll be in good shape.
Resolved. The African American population in Asheville has been disenfranchised. Let me say that Asheville, first up, is an agent of the state, and the state legislation that has expressed its will towards the participation of all of us through voter suppression laws. Quickly listed, there have been new requirements regarding voter ID. There are, of course, a reduced number of polling sites in the city. There are reduced times for early voting opportunities. So the very registration of potential voters has been restricted. For example, here at this high school, once you could register to vote at the end of the class in government and economics, and now you cannot. Once you could register to vote, it was automatic when you got your driver's license, now it is not. These attempts to suppress the vote, though, only express a limitation on a means to an end. Voting is not an end to itself. To be enfranchised is more than just to participate every 2, 4, 6 years. Really, what are the ends to which we buy our franchise? What part of our place in Asheville must we look to as an outcome of being full citizens? And so as a social scientist, I measure what that franchise means. I look at the rate of home ownership among African Americans. I look at the levels of education among African Americans. I look at the health status of adults and children living in Asheville. I look at criminal justice issues
from the first contact with Asheville Police Department to the reentry programs after leaving incarceration through the Department of Corrections. We can look at employment rates. We can look at business ownership. And over and over and over again do we see the outcomes of our citizenship being less than the outcomes of other citizenships. We see that our franchise has become a smaller piece of the pie. And this restriction on voter registration is no small piece of it. Let me say to you, in considering whether or not we are fully enfranchised citizens of Asheville, ask yourself simply the question of sharing power. If democracy is marked by our ability on election day to share power by simply expressing our one person, one vote rule, then what is it can we use as an explanation to explain the outcomes as being as racially disparate as if the Jim Crow signs were still on the doors? At some point, we must be held accountable. And so I say to you that the enfranchisement of African Americans must take place in a different way than what the state legislature has allowed us. If it takes back to remembering the days following the Civil War when violence was used, if it takes remembering the days when voter suppression took the form of literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses, if it takes the time for us to learn our history of what leads us to be suspicious and now we can show the outcomes of the current levels of legislation, then let it be so. Because the expression of democracy in this country is not just the right to vote, it is the right to enjoy the full measure of our citizenship.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, we're going to have 4 minutes on the comments side.
My name is Carl Mumpower. My colleague Isaac and I are grateful for this extraordinary opportunity. We honor our opponents, thank you, and those who have produced this special moment. In the 50s, our host, Wilma Dykeman, took the courageous step of writing a book highlighting the willful pollution of the French Broad River. She made some friends and many enemies as she challenged the obvious but neglected reality of a river of corruption. Importantly, her courage set the stage for the river of excellence we enjoy today. Though we are here to address a different matter, with your permission, we will embrace Wilma Dykeman's example and attempt her model of courage. We decisively reject the resolution before us. It is our firm belief that the evident marginalization of blacks in our community falls firmly into their own hands, and that the position of our opponents represent, at best, secondary impact, dwarfed by the self-inflicted harms we seek to highlight. We do not take this position lightly, for we realize we swim against an overwhelming current of public opinions, assumptions, and political correctness. It is our belief that these dated and habitual postures offer the resourcefulness of an echo. Our position is simple, that the black community of Asheville has harmed itself through the purchase of 2 great and tragic falsehoods. Number 1, that the future of black citizens is tied to something over which they have no control, color. And number 2, that they are not accountable for the 3 forces over which all people, regardless of color, retain supreme control: choice, character, and culture. Tonight we debate an issue of importance to all, for we truly rise or fall together. It is our deep hope that by confronting a deceptive bodyguard of lies, that like Wilma Dykeman, we may lay a foundation of truth, catalyzing something better, something clear, correct, and clean. And so in conclusion, it is our team's position that the black community of Asheville has persistently and conclusively subjugated itself. And it is our intention to detail the means. That mission lands firmly on 5 unchallengeable acts of self-betrayal, meriting our fullest attentions. Number one, the wholesale embrace of the corrupted public policies of the liberal socialist movement as defined in today's Democratic Party. Number two, the rejection of core indisputable truths affirmed in both the social sciences and the persisting messages of nature. Number three, the abandonment of an off-sided but largely ignored African heritage. Number four, the rejection of the true messages of the two most celebrated leaders of the rightful movement toward racial equality, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And number five, most crucially, the rejection of the teachings, values, and commandments of the faith that has angered Black Americans, all Americans through generations, Christianity. We delight in the opportunity to speak to these issues and will not shirk from the unrelenting demands of truth. For we come to you not merely for the stimulation of scholarly debate, but for the core mission of the human experience, to love and uphold our fellow man.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next up is the Grand Crossfire, which lasts for 3 minutes, and all speakers at both tables are allowed to speak during this time.
You know, Doctor, I'd like to address the one point, not many, regarding the refutation of our resolution, and that is that African Americans are responsible for their own positions. And I totally agree with that, to the extent that the larger society has allowed it to happen. We are restricted in a number of ways, particularly in voting rights that I listed, that have nothing to do with religion, have nothing to do with strength of character. It has everything to do with legalities and the enforcement of law by institutions.
Was that a question, sir?
Yes. And that the question becomes, how do you respond to institutional and systemic oppressions?
Well, I would disagree respectfully, sir, that the Black community is disenfranchised. That's the first Webster definition of what disenfranchised means, separated from the power to vote. I think there's great evidence that that is let me call it a myth, for lack of a better word. We had a Black mayor serve in Asheville for 8 years. We just elected an inexperienced young Black man to Asheville City Council. He was well represented by the Black vote, and I think the reality in Asheville speaks to just the opposite of what you're suggesting.
Mr. Mumpower, I would always also to buttress the point that Dr. Mullen has made about African Americans being responsible for their own disfranchisement. As a historian, that to me suggests a failure to take into consideration history and a historical legacy of racism, which is at the very foundation of this country. That cannot be denied. And when you take into consideration the history from slavery to emancipation and then to Jim Crow segregation and all that went with that, and now as we look at further what some have referred to as the new Jim Crow, and we look at the enormous number of African Americans who are in prison, and this is something that even one of a member of the Republican Party has taken this on in Rand Paul himself, and we look at the injustices of some of the laws that cause that to happen. How can you still hold to the position that African Americans are responsible for their own disfranchisement?
I think that's a great question. There's no argument about the racism. There's no argument about the hardships that the Black members of our community recently and in distant history have experienced. But that's the same hurdles that all people of all nations, of all colors, have experienced throughout history. And overcome...
We are at time, Mr. Mumpower.
We're out of time?
We are, sir. I'm sorry. All right. Next up is a rebuttal, which is for the pro side. We'll start this. The pro side will have 4 minutes to speak, followed by the con side with the same amount of time. Oh, gentlemen, if you want to take... You have 1 minute of time for preparation before this, if you'd like. We all need a minute of preparation here. Dr. Waters, before you begin, I'd just like to remind the audience that please note we're trying to limit input from you all. When you hear something you disagree with, please try to keep that to yourself.
Mr. Boyle, could I
Yes,
offer
sir.
a point of order? Would I be correct in saying that the question should have been back and forth?
Yes, and they notified me of that. The next time we have a grand crossfire, we want y'all to shorten up it should be a question, not so much a speech, and more of a back
And
and
we
forth.
can count on the team our opponents being penalized for the failures. We're good with that.
Okay. Dr. Waters, it's all yours.
Anything to win. Enfranchisement must take into consideration the past. These are the words of my esteemed colleague, Dr. Dwight Mullen. Defining words, the city as an agent of the state. As I listen to our opponents talk about the responsibility of African Americans themselves and being responsible for their own disfranchisement, as a historian, I'm troubled by that comment. For me, as a historian, history certainly matters. And in this country, I believe that there is a failure to focus on the tragic components of American history. This is not an argument that I make myself, but it is an argument of one esteemed Southern writer, Robert Penn Warren. In his own work, he expressed the fact that America likes to focus, as Americans, we love to focus on a progressive, a very triumphalist history. But this has not been the experience of African Americans. That experience has not been the same. The experience of African Americans in this country has not been the same of the experiences of other people in other countries. Slavery in the United States was fundamentally different, and it ended up creating a condition that has been hard to overcome. American tragedy, and to focus on American progress. As we consider those things, I think that it is incumbent upon us to look at the history and the experience of African Americans in this place. We know that even before integration here in Asheville, that there was a thriving community. Integration in some ways hurt that. There were thriving African American businesses on the block around the YMI. But one of the things that is interesting as we look at that history and that thriving community that developed there is that while African Americans were prevented from being able to engage the larger community was never restricted from engaging the African American community. Black businesses had to compete with white businesses that had much more capital than they had. And that still remains the case to this day. So these are policies, banking policies, housing policies towards education, and things that politicians have to deal with and debate that are not being taken into proper consideration when we look at these issues. I brought up the issue of the criminal justice system as well. And when I looked at that as a person who worked in the criminal justice system before going on to graduate school, you can see the disparities that exist there as well for African Americans, and that is not of their own doing. So I would ask that we take into consideration this history, that we learn to begin to take into consideration this tragic history that African Americans have had to experience. And it is not just a history that we as African Americans have to contend with, but I think it is a history that the larger country has to contend with as well.
Now it's time for the con side for a 4-minute rebuttal.
Bias on the basis of race, creed, gender, appearance, or religion is nothing new. America was originally settled by abused people from Europe. They in turn abused American Indians who had abused one another. Witnessed the Jewish experience in World War II and the horrors of Yugoslavia in the 90s. Witnessed the extraordinary brutality of ISIS today. The reality of blacks in America reflects a common tragedy of the human experience. It is not an exception. We thus find ourselves with a dilemma. We can endlessly recycle the historical reality of slavery and racism, or we can embrace history and ask how billions of other oppressed peoples have risen above their circumstances. It is our suggestion that from the turn of the last century until the 60s, the black race in America was doing just that. And per factual data, they were making remarkable progress toward equality. Now, something changed. It was called the War on Poverty, which by outcome most realistically became a war on minorities and the disadvantaged. The data is conclusive. In terms of health, economic standing, and employment, crime, and family unity, Black Americans have struggled to find the traction they were building at an earlier time. The choice of depending on government to fix things has proven to be disastrous. Earlier, Dr. Mumpower shared 4 self-initiated causes of harm, and we have saved the 5th, which is the best, for last. Quite simply, it has been the embrace of the Christian faith that earlier helped propel Black Americans out of a dark time. The betrayal of that faith and the Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ has had a reverse impact. Regrettably, this is a trend throughout our land. We have removed the 10 Commandments from our courthouses, jailhouses, and other public buildings. The Supreme Court has taken the Bible, prayer, and all reference to God out of our schools. Many of our churches have drifted from houses of worship into something more akin to houses of entertainment. The Holy Scriptures are broadly mocked and ignored, and thus we have lost the moral compass that has guided our nation through great tribulation. We have moved from Christ's message of love and responsibility to the inevitable outcomes of a society grounded on the whims of man, victimization, entitlement, greed, anger, division, immorality, and violence. It is our belief that until we return to the values outlined in the great document, the Bible, that birthed the most successful nation of the history of the world, all Americans, black, white, or otherwise, will suffer consequences of increasing intensity. To illustrate our point on the importance of the Bible, we would like to highlight the wisest man in history, King Solomon, and the insights he shared in the book of Ecclesiastes. At the end of his life, this gentleman was struggling, but he took the time to suggest 3 great truths. Number 1, that the foundation of all life is a faith in God and obedience to his commandments. Number 2, that most of all man's endeavors are driven by one trait, vanity. And number 3, that there are only 4 things in the human experience that really matter: to work, to love, to learn, and to celebrate the gift of life. It is his suggestion that everything else is in vain. We would like to suggest that Solomon's wisdom convicts us all, and thankfully it points the way for Asheville's black community to seize control of their own destiny.
Thank you, Mr. Herron. All right, we're going to have another grand crossfire here. Gentlemen, this time let's float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Good exchange back and forth.
I believe it's our turn. I'd like to ask her, am I correct?
You are,
I'd
sir.
like to ask my colleagues how they account for the fact that the Hispanic residents in our country now exceed in numbers the black residents, and how they account for the fact that people who have crossed our borders, many illegally, with nothing but the clothes on their back, are finding traction economically, academically, and socially and otherwise in our culture, whereas our fellow black Americans continue to remain in that stuck position that you suggested earlier.
A response to that is seen in the model minority myth that somehow Latinos are working their way up the ladder, when actually the social science, the data state that Latinas are the lowest paid workers that are to be found, that Latinos in their community represent probably the lowest paid within Buncombe County of all populations, and that the hardest working people are often the poorest people. And you can point back to slavery for that one. But if you want to generate wealth, it is not through hard labor. Wealth is generated through investment. And it's the investments in that capital which I point you towards a question, and that I'd like to understand how African Americans can have access to capital for investment when those doors are often locked, and that the outcomes indicate that we are not considered equal for those applications, for mortgages, for business, etc.
I would respectfully suggest that the Latin members of our community would disagree with you. They continue to cross our borders illegally for a purpose and continue, I think we're being somewhat disrespectful to suggest they come here and languish in poverty because the measurements don't suggest that. And they're coming here for a reason. They find an opportunity to gain traction towards something better, something more special, a higher level of living that is not available in their culture, in their countries, but is available in ours.
Carl, could you allow him a response? We're getting short on time.
They vote with their feet.
Let me suggest to you, that since I'm on a roll of disrespect, which I don't think, let me address this religious argument that somehow if we have faith and act like Solomon and we all are Christians, that it will solve the issue of oppressive politics. I'm not sure I understand that. Would you please go a little bit further and explain how our adherence to the Christian church, despite its history of slavery, despite its history of support of segregation, despite its participation in lynching, how can these very same institutions save us from ourselves?
If you will look at the traditional...
I'm sorry, Carl, we're out of time, but could you answer in, say, 20 seconds?
Yes. The most conservative Christians we've had in America historically have been Black Americans. And if you look at their ascendancy in the 50 years before the mid-60s, it was twice the rate of the rest of the culture. We would suggest that their faith had a big part to play in that.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Now, next up is a summary, 3 minutes on each side. They get that golden 1 minute of prep time again. So get prepping, fellas. All right, gentlemen, the pro side will have 3 minutes for summary.
In addressing again whether Asheville has disenfranchised this African American population, I'd like to point back again to the legislation that has been passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor that restricts opportunities for voting as well as registration on voting. Those points have yet to be addressed because there's no other way to deny that North Carolina, as a result, has become one of the most restrictive states in the nation regarding participation in the right to vote. Let me also address these other issues of individual responsibility versus systemic oppressions. I have never thought, and I think it is absolutely fundamental that we not think in a binary way, that we think in ways that are not mutually exclusive of each other. In fact, I would be the first to say that individual responsibility must and has always been a characteristic of the African American community. How else can you survive? Can you explain our survival? But that individual responsibility cannot take the place of systemic reforms. Neither can the role of reading into Old Testament or New Testament. But I will agree with you on this, that the church has also had a role, as well as temples, as well as our own living rooms as we pass on spirituality to our children. In that, we understand that beyond the institutions of the church, regardless of the immediacy of the politics of the day, that what gets us through is a belief that tomorrow will be a better day. That yesterday is not as good as it is today, and tomorrow will be even better. And we believe this with all of our hearts. Part of our culture, it stretches back to Africa. And if you take time to appreciate what you are seeing in every generation, not just any past generation is lacking in this generation. Look at this generation. You'll see again this deep belief in the possibilities of our futures together. And so, as we on a negative point in ending, let me suggest to you that one of the reasons why you must be concerned is that on the flip side is whether or not African Americans are the canaries in the mine. Whether or not your disenfranchisement depends on whether or not we are franchised.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. The time side will now have 3 minutes.
Again, allow me to share our delight in this special opportunity and our wish to honor this moment by not shirking from the truth. 5 truths doing great harm to the black members of our community were highlighted earlier. I'd like to bring further light to the first 4. My colleague has already spoken eloquently to the last and most important. The first is the embrace of a tarnished Democratic Party, resulting in 3 distinctive negative impacts. Number 1, public policies, including abortion, that have decimated the black family. Number 2, a massive influx of illegal aliens that has allowed employers to abandon our young black men and women as unnecessary. Number 3, governmental dependency policies that here in Asheville have 5 generations locked to public housing and subsistence living schemes, robbing hope and future potentials and dignity. We would offer that people make terrible pets. And then there is the persistent rejection of the truths of the social sciences and nature that have doomed our black culture to failure. 3 of those persisting messages include: 1, anger is a poison that destroys the container that holds it. Number 2, equality is earned, never given. The minute you ask for equality, you cease to be an equal. And number 3, the mother and the father are the foundation of the healthy family and the healthy culture and the healthy future. Everything else is less. Asheville's black community, ironically and by deed, has also rejected its African heritage in everything but name. The traits of that birthright merit specific attentions. Those include commerce, labor, individual accountability, loyalty, courage, and independence. Compass bearings rarely addressed in any presentation on improving the black experience, including that of our opponents tonight. And finally, there is the rejection of the core message and example of the 2 greatest black leaders in modern times, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. In these gentlemen, we find 3 distinct pleas. 1, that militancy is a stepping stone, not a landing place, for real change is never so easy. Number 2, that cultures who do not value women do not prosper. The value of black women as marked by behavior in the black culture is shameful. And number 3, that equality comes from living as an equal, never as a handout. It is our suggestion that the majority of today's black leaders are betraying everything that these 2 gentlemen lived and died for. In summary, the greatest impediment to black ascendancy centers on an obsessive dedication to the unmovable realities of color, and a failure to embrace the fixable matters of choice, character, and culture.
That is time,
with models
Dr.
that work.
Mumpower.
This is a reversible error. Tonight is the beginning.
Thank you, Dr. Mumpower. All right, now another grand crossfire, 4 minutes. Everyone allowed to speak. Lively back and forth. Keep your questions tight, please, gentlemen.
A really quick question for Dr. Mumpower. I'm very glad to hear you say tonight that Africa has a culture worth adhering to and remembering. But as a historian, in looking at the history of the country and the systematic dismantling of any connection to the African past that African Americans experienced here in this country, how do you explain and deal with that historical fact?
It's happened to every culture, every country in the world throughout history, with no exceptions. The exact same thing.
I take issue with that, Dr. Mumpower.
My question would be, considering that every vote counts as one vote, who are we to say that anyone has been disenfranchised? No, not one person in America that is a legal citizen and has not committed a felony has been disenfranchised. How can you keep that claim that anyone has been disenfranchised? Anyone.
You know, it's interesting because in responding to disfranchised, you have to look at the folk who I think are at the top of the list right now, in that a quarter of African American men are unable to vote because of criminal backgrounds. And the ex-offender is probably a primary example of being disfranchised, as having lost the citizenship. In this state, it takes 5 years to regain citizenship. But in those 5 years, look what damage has occurred to the community. But I think more importantly is the question of outcomes. And no one has addressed the outcomes of public policy as examples of a full citizenship of African Americans. Why is that? Why is it that we have not addressed that?
We have to, sir,
Yes.
sir, if I may, I would suggest the percentage of eligible black voters that actually turn out to vote mock your point about the young men who are in prison. That's a serious matter, but it has nothing to do with voting percentages or access to the voting booth. The percentages are actually lower than a shameful white vote. And if you would repeat that last part of your question.
Well, on the first part, I think that it is very much symptomatic of what is happening to African Americans in the city, in that the idea of voting yielding nothing in return other than leadership that can be easily neutralized simply because of their isolated and tokenized positions. But on the other hand,
You sound like you're talking to
on the other
Republicans.
hand, well, yeah. On the other hand, what I'm actually addressing is what the research, and I resent honestly the ban that we are supposed to use social science evidence, is that in every public policy area, in every area that was once legislated by Jim Crow segregation, we find the exact identical, if not worse, outcomes. And I doubt seriously if we can honestly, with straight face, point to the war on poverty as the problem. I think that the war on poverty that ended under Richard Nixon probably would be grateful to have this kind of publicity.
May we hit the question?
Let's give Dr. Mumpauer, Mr. Herron, a chance to respond.
The statistics definitely point to the fact of a descendancy since the war on poverty began in terms of socioeconomic measures. That's a serious concern. We've spent trillions of dollars and our black culture is sliding down, and I think we share concern for that. That's why we're here tonight.
And if I may follow up, I'd like to, if possible, explain my very presence here, because I am a product of the war on poverty. If it had not stepped into Watts, I would never have escaped. If
Dr.
people-
Mullen,
Yes.
we're at time. I gave him 20 seconds earlier. If you can do this in 20 seconds. Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. All right. Next up is the final focus. One more golden minute of preparation, and then you'll have a final focus, which takes place at the podium. That is 1 minute.
Again, thank you for this opportunity to discuss this question. 1965, James Baldwin debated William Buckley at Oxford Union in England. And in that speech and in that debate, the question was, has the American dream been at the expense of the American Negro? Arguing the pro, James Baldwin pointed out that we live and we function under certain systems of reality that sometimes we do not even know that we exist within. As I listen to the arguments that our opponents have made, I'm struck and I'm reminded of the point that James Baldwin made about certain systems of reality. The system of reality that still encourages a triumphalist narrative of American history. So when we look at that debate that James Baldwin participated in 1965, he made one point about the Voting Rights Act. As it was being debated to be passed in 1965, he looked at the history of African Americans and their experience in this country, and he said that African Americans at that time did not believe and trust the federal government to enforce the Voting Rights Act then because they had failed to enforce so many other acts that had been passed in the past. A case in point would be Brown versus Board of Education and the slowness with which that process was implemented. When we look at things now, Dr. Mullen has brought up the issue of fair housing. Fair housing laws were passed in the 1960s, and in 2001, in an NPR report, it was reported that these fair housing laws are rarely enforced by the government. So this raises the question, not about the responsibility of African Americans, but their continued fight to get the federal government and the state government and the city government to actually live up to the policies that are implemented and to enforce those policies. I look at this has been the history of African Americans in this country, and it makes it difficult for
Dr.
many of us.
Waters, unfortunately, your time is up, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hammond, you'll have 2 minutes.
We remain grateful for the opportunity and an audience of open minds. We are especially grateful to our opponents and that they have demonstrated a key point. Our dialogue on race has been so long stuck in a vacuum of political correctness that even our own scholars do not recognize their conditioning. We appreciate that. We would like to also remind you of the mission of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It is our sober belief that if these gentlemen were grading us today, we would win decisively. To further seal our position, we would wish to draw on a third black figure modeling how Asheville's black citizens can make their way through a tangled web of wrong-minded messages. Loretta Mary Aiken was one of 16 children. At age 11, her father, a volunteer fireman, died when his fire engine exploded. On Christmas Day, her mother was killed walking home from church. By 14, Jackie had been raped twice and had 2 children taken for adoption. She had run away to find her place in the world. And through subsequent television appearances, movies, and records, this singer-entertainer earned the reputation as the funniest woman in the world. This black American, known by the stage name of Moms Mabley, was born in Brevard, North Carolina. She refused to be defined by her tragedies, her limitations, or the racist society of her birth. Her life brightly illuminates why we so vigorously reject the resolution before us. Miss Mabley refused to be defined by her color, and she embraced the matters of choice, character, and culture with a liberated and courageous spirit. To suggest that the black members of our community are less capable is the height of racism.
Thank you, Mr. Herron. All right, folks, it is time for the student judges to deliberate. We're going to extend their time for 10 to 10 minutes, and we're going to take questions. Remember, the questions are for the teams. So I think the easiest way is I might just walk around. If you raise your hand, I'll come to you. And if you don't mind speaking into the mic, we'll do it that way. Or I can say the question if you want me to. And I'll ask you to keep your question very tight, please. No speechify.
This goes out to Dr. Power now. So you saying not belief in Christianity made Mumford go from a 95% black community to over a 95% white community? And not politicians with higher taxes?
John, I couldn't understand the question. Could you repeat it?
I think his point is Montford has transformed from a 95% black community to 95% white community. And how is that a result of lack of faith in Christianity? Is that a fair assessment, sir?
That's a result of liberal Democrats is what it's a result of.
I'll go ahead.
And Mr. Herron?
I would just mention that you can't blame politicians and lawmakers for something when the taxes are the same across the country.
All right. Hang on.
No, let me answer his question seriously.
Okay.
No one disagrees that the black culture, the black people of our community are suffering. Our disagreement is with why. And we believe the mission is to increase that level of personal accountability. That's the only way out of a trap that we keep repeating.
Thank you, Dr. Mumpower. Next question, sir.
Hi, this is directed to your team. You said that all groups in this country have faced the same hurdles. None of my ancestors have ever had the same rights as the car that I drove here today. Could you please explain?
Yes, you have to go back to the point in history. Every culture, every country in the world, without exception, has gone through harm, degradation, and abuse. And if you go back to a certain point, I was born in England. My mother is English. If you go back in my history, there were the same oppressions, the same miseries, the same woes. It's been there throughout our history. The only way we rise above that is through individual accountability and values that work, not in blaming someone else, not in asking for equality. It never works.
Thank you, Dr. Mumpower. Could we get a question for the other side? Does somebody have a question for the other side so we balance this out a little bit?
Dr. Mullen, Dr. Waters, could you help us understand, please, how the education system has participated in the results that we see for the African American community?
That's a good question. Historically, as a historian, African Americans have always been had fewer resources than the larger community. That's a historical fact that cannot be denied. During the period of segregation here in this community, my parents, who went to Stevens Lee High School here, one of the things that they recall the most is having second-hand material that came from the other schools. This has always been the case for many African American. That experience has been the case across the board, and that cannot be denied. And I think in some ways that still exists. Our opponents talk about personal responsibility, but I don't hear them say anything about opportunity and opportunities being open to actually to build a better life.
When the schools were desegregated, the federal courts laid out 5 categories by which we could measure progress. And in those 5 categories, the Asheville City Schools, Blount County Schools, they're not really any different than any other major school system in the country. But here in Asheville, the discipline rates, the academic performances, whether or not there was tracking, for example, schools within schools that segregated, the hiring of faculty and staff, the numbers of African Americans actually hired was monitored. The retention, in other words, dropout rates were monitored, and graduation rates. Those 5 areas were empirical measures by which we could say African Americans are a unified school system rather than the segregated school system. In none of those areas have we ever been equal. The court withdrew its observations before ever the system remedied those problems, and those problems persist to 2015.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. I've got a question here. I think it can be directed toward both sides. Is that what you said? Hang on just a second.
Hi, I'm Simon Alm. I'm a senior from Asheville High, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight and debating this topic with us. My question is for, first, the con side. Considering you have failed to evaluate any evidence supporting your stance and have wholly relied on a moral obligation of Black Americans, can you please explain to me why why Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be caught and convicted for marijuana use in states where it is illegal when whites and blacks use marijuana at the same rate?
I thought marijuana usage was legal in Asheville.
We're talking poverty, and there's no argument that the Black culture struggles with poverty at a greater level than most people of the white culture. And I think it's a simple equation. That does not give anyone a free pass from their choices. And we continue to preach that message in our community and across the country, that your choices, your character, your cultural model doesn't work. Nobody can catch me smoking marijuana because I don't smoke marijuana. And that choice should not be ignored. And to do that to our children, the children in this school, in this audience, I think is a tragic portrayal of their future, to pretend that their choices don't matter. That's the ultimate control over our personal life.
Doctor, hang on just a second. Hang on, we're going to get to that. Did you hear what he was saying? Disproportionate. What I'd like to do is because we're going to run out of time, is give Dr. Mullen and Dr. Waters, would y'all like to take a crack at that, what he just said, trying to explain the disproportionate conviction rates for the same offense? Carl, when they speak, we'll give you a chance to, or your cohort here to give a response.
These disparities in how the criminal justice system responds can be found throughout the entire way, from the first contact with police through the reentry programs. At every stage, when subjective decisions can be made, what we find the explanation for the disparities are that the subjective decisions are made in favor of whites more often than they are in blacks, and it accumulates with each stage of the due process. For example, here at UNC Asheville, undergrads have done research regarding the stoppage rates of African Americans by the APD. And from being stopped, searched, cited, and arrested, each of those 4 areas is 4 times the rate for black men than it is for white women.
May I, Mr. Bull? It's my personal
Carl,
belief.
if you could keep this to about 1 minute, I'm over here.
Yeah.
1 minute, because I want to try to get up in the back.
I can keep it to about 20 seconds. I think the criminal justice system in America is the portal to hell for everybody, not just blacks. And the best way to stay out of there is to make the proper choices and to raise our children to make the proper choices. We don't do that. And we betray our children with that dysfunctional message.
Okay, I told this gentleman here we'd ask questions, and I see the hands in the back. I'll try to get maybe 2 in the back, but we got to watch our time.
I just have a question for Mr. Powell. I came here to listen to the people here to debate about black people, but did you mention Hispanics? Because you want to divide Hispanics and blacks?
Are you clear on that, Dr. Montero?
I'm an old guy and I can't hear
I think the question would come down to, you seem to be interested in dividing blacks and Hispanics in some way.
I'm not interested in dividing anybody, just the opposite. Unfortunately, the facts create that division, not me. And that's a common approach to our whole dialogue on race. The minute we raise truths and facts, we start trying to discredit the messenger or to create some kind of suspected or suspicion of malice or racism. That's not why we're here tonight. Neither of us need to be here. We're here because these young men and young women do not have an honest voice.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Montero. I got one question from the back here.
Yeah, hi. It seems, this is for Carl's team, it seems like your basic argument comes down to blaming the victim. And I want to ask how you justify that in light of, I'll just give 2 of perhaps hundreds of examples. One is the crack cocaine and powdered cocaine are chemically identical. And yet, crack cocaine is used mostly by blacks, powdered cocaine is mostly used by wealthy white people. The conviction rate for crack cocaine, the incarceration rate is about 15 times what it is for powdered cocaine. How come that is? One other just very quick thing is there was recently a series of social science experiments done where identical resumes were sent out for job openings. And half of them went out in the name of names that sounded like black names, Yashida and so forth. The other ones went out in the names of John Smith. Almost all of the results, all of the calls that got back went to the ones with white-sounding names rather than black-sounding names. How do you justify blaming the victim when there's an obviously lack of opportunity?
And on this one, Carl, if Mr. Herron, would he like to weigh in? I don't want to put you on the spot too much. And Mr. Herron, after you, we'll let Dr. Waters and Dr. Mullen weigh in on this too.
First and foremost, we can't speak for anyone else except for the people on the stage. But I just want to point out that lack of money is not an exception for not being able to vote. The argument here and the resolution before us is being disenfranchised, and money has nothing to do with having the right to vote.
All right, Dr. Mullen, Dr. Waters, would y'all take a shot at this one, please?
Yeah, I would just make this point. This is tonight's topic and the debating of this particular question is a difficult one because, I mean, the facts are what the facts are. I mean, we're being asked to prove what the facts are, and then listening to an argument that essentially does exactly what you said, blame the victim for this. To me, this is delusional. It is a denial of history. And what is interesting to me is that African Americans seem to be asked to forget their historical experiences. But we don't forget 1776. We don't forget all of these triumphalist examples of American history. We don't forget those. We celebrate those all the time. But as African Americans, we're asked to just say, okay, it happened, now get over it. But these are problems that still remain, and I would say that this is a very difficult question to even argue and to try to prove because the facts are what they are.
Gentlemen, we've got one more question. Dr. Mumpower, I trust you to keep this to 25 seconds.
How about 5 seconds? The efforts to reduce our arguments to that simple phrase of blaming the victim affirms every point we've tried to make tonight.
Thank you, sir. One more question, and then we're going to move to the judges' assessments here. Yes, sir.
I'm going to try my best to keep my blood pressure down. It's getting a little high. I'm going to try to stay calm, though. I think it's interesting that you raised this issue of victim blaming when we're not even talking about victim blaming. What we're talking about here is you're talking about individual responsibility when there's the people who are imparting an unfair treatment towards a certain individual. It's not, how can you tell someone that is receiving a certain kind of treatment that it's their own fault, that they're not taking responsibility for what's happening to them when it's out of their control, when it's systematic and it's structural in the way that, the way that you treat me, the way that you see me, just by looking at me has nothing to do with my own responsibility. It's just the result of how you see an individual, and it's that reaffirming of certain stereotypes, and as long as that remains, there's never going to be any change of that treatment.
I think we can crystallize that down. It's sort of a question about profiling and making snap judgments, how to overcome that when you are the minority being judged. Is that a fair assessment?
Let me give,
Dr. Mullen, go ahead.
I'd like to give a comment. I don't know how to get through when it's clearly an issue of individual responsibility that's always on the table, that if you are a human being, you have individual responsibilities. But it does not speak to institutional and systemic, for centuries, kinds of outcomes. But let me try to speak through that very quickly, in that in the Bible, there is a tradition. And it's sort of what separates the Old Testament from the New Testament, but the idea of the Good Samaritan comes in. And the idea of finding a victim on the road, someone beaten, robbed, someone who was left destitute, and asking them what did they do to cause it was not part of what Jesus was saying.
Dr. Mullen, let's give Dr. Mumpower and Mr. Herron, say a minute, because we need to move along, to respond to that. Thank you.
It is not our suggestion, it's the opposite, that to encourage people to believe that the members of our black community, it's all their responsibility. Of course that's not true. Who could ever suggest that? But the responsibility, no, you need to listen more carefully. The responsibility for the recovery is in their hands, and that's the only place where the power of dignity and a future rests. And what we've been doing for 50 years proves that is the case.
Oh, okay. I was just informed that we have not had a woman ask a question, which my wife, okay. This lady over here, I know, okay, we'll do two. Are y'all in a hurry to get out of here, folks? Okay, all right. We'll do this lady here and ma'am over there. I'm sorry. Okay, and Great question. She's asking, do you feel that African American women have it worse in this country than African American men? And if so, why or why not? Let's start with Mr. Herron and Dr. Mumpower. Carl, let's say minute and a half, please.
I think black females in America have the hardest road to hoe of anybody in our culture. I think the way that you are treated by your own and everyone else is shameful.
Dr. Mullen, Dr. Waters, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, there's a sister who writes, Bell Hooks, she talks about being double yoked. And it's the idea of dealing with racism and with sexism. And what sisters have done over the years is shown ways and given examples through their life and behaviors of how to simultaneously deal with two oppressions. And so I really, from my way of seeing it, I grew up in a way that never depicted, I would never have guessed that they were carrying double the weight that I was carrying, because they were the ones carrying me.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. One last question.
Thank you very much, sir. My question is to Dr. Carl. You said in your speech that equal treatment or equality is not given, it's earned, but how exactly are minorities in general supposed to overcome whatever struggles that they may have when they aren't given equal treatment from the start? My second question is the fact that you praised Malcolm X along with Dr. Martin Luther King, but Malcolm X was very militant, he was anti-Semitic, and he was racist towards whites, and he promoted separatist policies. Are you insinuating that black Americans or minorities are supposed to separate from society and remove themselves?
Carl, are you straight on both of those?
I think I've got that. Well, with all respect, you need to read a little more about Malcolm X, because he had four.
Okay, let the man talk.
He had four distinct periods in his life, and in the last one, he rejected violence. He rejected adversarial process. He spoke just the language that we have spoken to you tonight about accountability and seizing control of our own destiny. In the last 6 months of his life, that is arguably why he was executed by the Nation of Islam. In terms of your earlier question, again, I would respectfully suggest to you that history is filled with examples of billions of people who have had to overcome great hardship. And they did not do it with other people's assistance. They did it by digging in their own hands in the dirt, in whatever they had, to rise above the misery and oppression that they encountered. We should learn from their lesson and example, not continue to repeat the same errors.
Thank you, Dr. Mumpower. I'd like to give Dr. Mullen and Dr. Waters about a minute to respond, and then we are going to go to the judges.
Yeah, part of it is the Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass way of politics, is that you start seeing things in ways that nobody else sees it. Now, for conservatives to claim Malcolm X is just ridiculous. So we're talking about it, but it follows along with this idea following the Civil War that the party of Lincoln is the same party that's in charge of Congress now. These things are just ludicrous. And so when you get into it and see the use of language, when someone confronts you and says, well, Martin Luther King was a member of the Republican Party, you should be able to respond and say, then let us put in Dr. Martin Luther King's democratic socialist policies. What do you say about his refusal to deal with the very same types of de facto Jim Crow segregation we are dealing with here in Asheville?
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. And with that, we are going to turn it over to the judges. I wish I could take more questions, folks. I'm sure we could be here for 2 more hours. You've asked great questions. We're going to turn over to the judges. Before you leave here tonight, do everybody a favor. They're selling a lot of items, some baked goods and other things out in the lobby. It all goes to support the club here, and they could really use it, even if you're not going to eat it. Buy it, give it to me, and I'll eat it. But I really would appreciate that. I'm going to turn it back over to Chloe here. Hang on.
Okay, and just 2 more quick announcements. First, if everyone could stop by the Legacy debate table, the Legacy table in the lobby, there's a sign-up sheet so you can hear about the next 2 debates we are also hosting in the future. And then secondly, there's also people in the rotunda who are available to register people to vote. So we highly encourage people to do that as well. So now we're going to move into our judge disclosures. These are varsity members of our debate team. They're all very experienced, and they have been instructed to not vote on their biases and instead vote exactly what was going on in the debate and the arguments that were made and whether or not they were valid. So first, I'd like to turn over to our first judge.
All right, hello everybody. I'll be addressing these comments to the judges. My name is Stephen Baez. I'm a senior here at the high school and a third-year debater. So first of all, I'd just like to thank you all for not only providing a great debate, but also an excellent template for how these discussions should take place, whether that be on social media or in person. So just thank you all for that. Now, I'll be judging this round based on what we call in debate voter issues. So these are not the issues, the only issues that you guys talked about today, and they're not the only ones that affect the African American community. They are, however, the ones that have the most implications for tonight's debate. So I'll go into those now. First off, my biggest voter issue, or not my biggest, but my first one is religion. So this was an excellent point brought up by the con, and Pro never really addressed the role that this has had, certainly since the shift in the 1960s that they addressed. Now, the second point, and this is on the Pro side, is about outcomes, and Pro certainly wins this. So Con, in one of the initial stages, brought up an excellent point about the black leaders that we have elected here at in Asheville. I think they pushed harder on that. This would have been a very different debate. But the point that Pro kept coming back to again and again is that outcomes are an important part of franchisement, and that was never really successfully addressed by the con side. Now, a third voter issue is the current afflictions. And this, I think, is the key to the debate. Because in the initial stages, they brought up restrictions that have come into place, whether that be polling or registration. And these are not things of the past. These are not remnants from a long distant history. These are things that are still here and still oppressing African American minorities. And on that issue, the Pro wins. So the fourth voter issue is the history that we're facing. So for me, this was kind of a wash because Pro had some excellent points about a triumphalist history, and Con made some equally great points about how you can escape this loop and there's ways that you can take control of your own character. Finally, another issue that the con won is the shift away from MLK and Malcolm X. Now, we've talked about this at length here in the questioning period, but during the debate, there wasn't quite as much resolution on this from the Pro side about what the shift has meant for the black community and how that's affected them. Finally, the sixth voter issue is about what is franchisement, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And on this most important issue, Pro wins, because one of the best points that Con made was all about how one person, one vote. But in their initial speech, Pro talked about how franchisement is more than just voting, it's about outcomes. And that was the one point that they furthered again and again that Con never really talked about. Because yes, everyone can vote, but then why don't we see that reflected in our legislature? So for these reasons, I'm going to vote for Pro, because they made clear that franchisement is about more than just voting, and they provided lots of evidence about polling changes that have explicitly targeted African American minorities.
All right, so my colleagues' last voter issue will be my first, and that is, what does disenfranchisement actually mean? And I found the Pro's argument more persuasive here, because words do mean much more than what the dictionary says. There's always subtext and implication and metaphor, and that's all inherent in the way that we use language. And, otherwise poets would be out of business. So I think when we take into account all of that, we can see that disenfranchisement means more than just voting, but it also means the access to political power. And so the question becomes whether the African American community has been denied that power. Now, both sides agree that the history of the African American community has been tragic. So the question is, does this continue? And I found the evidence and the statistics that the Pro side provided to be much more persuasive, including the statistics on disproportionate criminalization and imprisonment. I found that there was not much that the con side provided to combat that. So then, when we look at that, what we see is that the final question, the final voter issue is, should the government take action, or should the government recognize that disenfranchisement? And what we see is that even if it's partially the responsibility of the African American community, and even if, you know, perhaps the government should allow that community to raise itself up through its own labor, still ignoring the fact that this discrimination happens is disenfranchisement itself. Thus, I voted pro. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Probst. I'm a sophomore this year, and I would like to thank all four of you for coming out tonight. We know it's really important to the community that you've shown these different ideas that are representative of what a lot of America believes. And so I do a different type of debate than my colleagues do, where it's less about specific voter issues and more about the fundamental points of argument and how they apply to each other. So the main reason that I'm going to decide my vote tonight is who is better able to prove the basis of their argument. On the pro side, that was the idea that discrimination and inequality is caused by systemic faults in society. And on the con side, your primary argument seemed to be that it was discrimination and disenfranchisement and disequality was built primarily on the fault of African American communities. The pro side seemed more to be able to prove solid evidence and concrete basis for disenfranchisement on the behalf of society. They brought up the idea that you cannot exist in a vacuum and that communities cannot be isolated from one another. They pointed out that history is a deciding factor in the way that the present works today, and they pointed out that right now there are much more institutions that work on tearing down communities, like the criminal justice system, and like our inability as certain communities to vote. And they pointed out that these are much more prominent in the system than some of the things that work towards advancement. The con side, on the other hand, seemed more to be working towards the idea that African Americans were disenfranchising themselves, and they based this on isolated pieces of evidence and isolated individuals who are able to work themselves up from poverty and from inequality. This seems less able to prove points than the pro side's systemic proofs and institutions and specific examples than your arguments were. You brought up some excellent points as far as the con side went. You pointed out that there are moral responsibilities, there are responsibilities that all communities need to take within the system, and you pointed out that there are certain things that are perpetuated within society that are harmful to everyone. However, the strength of the pros arguments were based more on specific examples, while yours were based more on isolated incidents that don't necessarily prove causation. And for that reason, my vote is going, as with my colleagues, towards the pro.
My name is Lisa Karczewski. I'm a junior at Asheville High, and I'm a third-year debater. So much like Eli and Stephen, my biggest voter issue was how you framed what disenfranchisement meant and what enfranchisement would mean. So Pro really gave the better frame for what I had to judge this debate on, which was that enfranchisement meant to have full extent of your citizenship and be able to participate in every aspect of that. So I had to vote pro because they proved that African Americans were not reaching this full extent of their citizenship because they are being locked up at much higher rates. They are lacking education services and just overall not reaching the same potential as white Americans because they're lacking these specific things, and therefore I had to vote pro.
Hi, my name is David Matthews. I am a junior at Asheville High School. This debate really came down for me on the points that both sides made about whether or not African Americans were able to seize the opportunities they have, and whether or not that was disenfranchisement or whether they were fully enfranchised. And there was one really there was one debate that really came down to this for me, that brought in a lot of points from both sides, and that was the debate that started with the con mentioning the fact that illegal immigrants coming into the society seem to be rising compared to African Americans, and how that they're seizing their opportunity. However, the pro brought up this point that the fact that the restriction of things like voting rights and the restriction of the full right to citizenship and enjoying all of this prevented the seizing of those opportunities, and how that really kind of refuted that point. However, then the con brought up the point of the fact that that everyone does have a vote. So how is it disenfranchisement if you have a vote? But then the pro brought up the point about the fact that much of the African American population is being incarcerated at a much higher rate. So there's a higher rate of African Americans in prison, and that means that they're not going to be able to vote as much. Then Con refuted this by pointing out the fact that even though that may be the case, there's a low voter turnout among African Americans. So it's not really the fault of the prison so much as the fault of the African American population. But then what really sealed the deal for this debate was Pro's point about how can you expect outcomes from voting if you haven't had outcomes in the entire history of living in this country. And the specific examples of bringing up about slavery, bringing up about the Voting Rights Act, and how there hasn't been really proper implementation of those laws and of the things that we're trying to prevent in discrimination, that really kind of sealed the deal, and you can't really expect an outcome if you haven't gotten an outcome in every other situation in history, and that sets a historical precedent. Therefore, I voted pro like the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Asheville High judges. That seems to be a 5-0 tally for the pro side. Before we wrap up, I know Mr. Stokely wants to say something, and I would like to thank all four of these good gentlemen for coming out here. A round of applause for all of them, please. I think, we really should appreciate that we live in a community where we can have this kind of discussion, a civil discussion that everyone enjoyed, a lot of great points made. And we will do this again. Please come to our next two events. Mr. Stokely, we'll wrap this up.
One date, January 29th, 2016. January 29th, 2016, that's debate number 2, right here, same time, same channel. Resolved, the organic food, eat local movement will never substantially address food insecurity.
Can we make Dr. Mumpower argue that one?
Arguing against that will be John Swan of Katua Market and Whole Foods, as well as Jamie Yeager of Hickory Nut Gap Farm. Arguing for it will be Bill Yarborough, regional agronomist for the State Department of Agriculture, and an as yet to be named partner, and you need to be here January 29th, 2016. Thank you so much for coming.